Single dad, CEO collapses at Gala. What the nurse discovers next shocks everyone. He was the ruthless CEO, who believed he was untouchable until the night his heart betrayed him in front of the world. At his own charity gala, Alexander Grant collapsed, and the only person who could save him was the nurse he humiliated and fired 2 years earlier. Clara Davis never imagined she'd hold the life of the man who destroyed hers. But fate had other plans. What began as a medical emergency turned into a battle of pride redemption and second chances. How far must a man fall before he sees what truly matters? Stay until the end. You won't believe the twist. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our latest stories. Enjoy the story. The ballroom glittered like a palace from another world. Golden chandeliers cascaded light over marble floors, and the air buzzed with the kind of conversations only the elite could afford. Deals whispered over crystal glasses, laughter layered with power plays. Cameras flashed, capturing the faces of the rich and powerful, all gathered for the annual Grant Foundation Charity Gala, a night of opulence disguised as philanthropy. At the heart of it all stood Alexander Grant, the man who owned the room the night, and some would say the city itself. At 45, he was the image of relentless success, tall, commanding, with silver streaks in his jet-black hair that only made him look more distinguished. His tuxedo was hand-stitched perfection, like everything else in his life. To the world, he was a titan. To his 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, sitting in the front row, in a delicate lavender dress, he was still just daddy. She watched him with wide, adoring eyes as he took the stage, the lights catching the hard angles of his face, the crowd falling into reverent silence. "Good evening." Alexander's voice filled the hall, deep and composed, crafted over years of boardrooms and billion-dollar speeches. Tonight, we gather not only as leaders, but as custodians of change. The Grant Foundation is pledging $10 million to build children's cardiac centers in underserved communities. The audience applauded their polite enthusiasm, carefully measured. But from the front row, Sophie clapped the loudest, her tiny face beaming with pride. But in the middle of his sentence, Alexander faltered. It was so subtle at first, a tremor in his hand, a flicker of confusion behind his steel-gray eyes. Then came the sweat beating along his hairline, the sudden shallowness of his breath. His polished facade cracked as his vision blurred. He gripped the podium as if the weight of the entire room pressed against his chest. Sophie. His voice fractured into a rasp, barely audible over the whispers growing into gasps. Then the microphone clattered to the floor, sending a jarring screech through the hall. Alexander's body buckled, collapsing in a graceless heap at the foot of the podium. The room exploded into chaos. Guests screamed, froze filmed. In the midst of it all, Sophie's expression morphed from awe to horror. She screamed out, breaking away from her nanny's grip, rushing toward the stage. "Daddy, please don't leave me like Mommy." Her sobs pierced the noise, raw and desperate. But while the powerful, panicked one figure moved with precision, at the far end of the ballroom, Clara Davis, dressed in a simple catering uniform, dropped the tray of champagne she was holding. Her instincts took over. She hadn't worn scrubs in 2 years, but the nurse in her had never left. "I'm a nurse. Move." Clara's voice cut through the hysteria like a blade. She pushed through the crowd, vaulted over a decorative barrier, ignoring security trying to block her path. "Ma'am, you can't." "He's in cardiac distress." She barked her tone, brooking no argument. Every second counts. "Move." Without waiting, Clara dropped to her knees beside Alexander, assessing him with swift, practiced hands. She checked his carotid pulse, adjusted his airway, loosened his suffocating tie. Around her chaos reigned guests, clutching their pearls, cameras still flashing, recording the moment America's most invincible CEO lay helpless. Sophie collapsed at her father's side, her sobs shaking her tiny frame. Clara wrapped an arm protectively around the girl while keeping her other hand firmly on Alexander's wrist. "Sweetheart," she whispered, voice soft but unyielding. "Listen to me. Your daddy's heart is working too hard right now, but I'm here. I won't let him go." Alexander's eyelids fluttered, his disoriented gaze catching the blurry image of Clara holding his daughter, a haunting echo of a family portrait from a life he could barely remember anymore. The wail of approaching sirens grew louder, but in that moment, the world shrank to three figures: the fallen king, the little girl clutching his sleeve, and the woman who should have been nowhere near them, yet somehow felt like the only one who belonged. When the paramedics arrived, the stage was already a battlefield Clara had claimed as her own. They found her kneeling between father and daughter, calm in the face of devastation. In the sterile hush of the hospital suite, hours later, the man who had built an empire woke not as a CEO, but as a patient. His first instinct was to bark orders, demand discharge, pretend nothing had changed. But everything had. The man who had fired Clara Davis 2 years ago for standing up to his negligence now owed her his life, and neither of them had any idea that their paths had only just begun to collide in ways neither could control nor predict. Because sometimes life cracks us open when we least expect it, forcing us to see what we've refused to face. That strength isn't measured by how much we control, but how much we're willing to let go. And for Alexander Grant, that lesson was only just beginning. Stay tuned for the next part of this gripping emotional journey, where Alexander is forced to confront his deepest fears, and Clara finds herself torn between past wounds and an unexpected future. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next heart-pounding chapter. The sterile hush of the hospital suite contrasted starkly with the grandeur of the ballroom where Alexander Grant had ruled only hours ago. Now stripped of his tailored armor, he lay tethered to monitors and IV lines, his heartbeat exposed on a screen for anyone to see. He hated it. Alexander tried to sit up, his head pounding with stubborn resistance. He'd barely opened his eyes and already barked at the attending physician for updates. When told he had been unconscious for nearly 24 hours due to severe exhaustion, dehydration, and dangerously high blood pressure, he dismissed the warnings as melodramatic overreactions. He was a CEO, not some fragile civilian. "Discharge me," he demanded, his voice hoarse, but still carrying the weight of authority. The doctor hesitated, knowing who he was dealing with. "Mr. Grant, this is not simply fatigue. Your body is sounding alarms you can no longer ignore. You need rest intervention and serious lifestyle changes." Alexander scoffed, yanking the IV from his arm, leaving the nurse scrambling to stop the bleeding. He wouldn't be coddled like an invalid. At that moment, the suite door opened quietly, and Clara Davis stepped inside, her posture, steady face, unreadable. She held Sophie by the hand. The girl broke free the moment she saw her father awake, clambering onto the bed, wrapping tiny arms around his torso. "Daddy." Sophie beamed through tear-streaked cheeks. "You scared me." Alexander's stone-like demeanor softened for a heartbeat. He stroked his daughter's hair, inhaling the comfort of her presence. but his gaze sharpened when it drifted past her to Clara. "Why is she here?" he asked coldly. Clara stood her ground. "Your staff requested I stay with Sophie. She wouldn't leave your side last night." Alexander's jaw clenched. "That won't be necessary anymore. I'm awake." Sophie protested immediately. "Daddy, no, Miss Clara is nice. She told me stories. She promised you'd be okay." Alexander's voice softened for his daughter. "We're fine on our own, like always." But there was a crack in his tone. One Clara didn't miss. Clara chose her words carefully. "Children are more perceptive than we give them credit for, Mr. Grant. Sometimes they see what we try hardest to hide." He glared at her using the familiar shield of arrogance. "I don't need philosophy from a former nurse." Her smile was calm, almost pitying. "No, you don't. But you might need honesty." Before the conversation could escalate, the doctor interjected, recommending more tests and extended observation. Alexander dismissed him with a wave, pulling off the remaining monitoring cables. "You people love to scare us into submission. I've built an empire. Stress comes with the job." Clara stepped forward. "The human body doesn't negotiate, Mr. Grant. It doesn't care how many companies you run. It will keep sending warnings until you listen or until it's too late." For a flicker of a second, he looked at her, truly looked, and something in her gaze unsettled him. A challenge, a truth he didn't want to face. Sophie clung to his arm, her tiny voice trembling. "Daddy, please don't be mad at Miss Clara. She saved you." That small plea landed like a punch to the gut. Alexander turned away, masking his emotion. "You've been dismissed, Ms. Davis." But as she left the room, Clara didn't look like someone defeated. She looked like someone who knew that the war had only just begun, and that the fortress Alexander built around himself had finally visibly cracked. 3 days later, back in his penthouse that overlooked the entire skyline, Alexander tried to reclaim his life. The monitors were gone. The stage lights dimmed. But the fear remained lurking in the shadows of his luxurious office, where he barked orders to his executives, his phone burning with calls, his laptop buzzing with unchecked emails. Sophie sat in the corner, hugging her teddy bear, her eyes no longer filled with awe, but with quiet worry. The doorbell rang. Alexander barely glanced up when his housekeeper announced, "Ms. Davis is here to see Sophie. She brought some books." He grunted. "Send her away. Sir, Miss Sophie has been asking for her. She said Ms. Clara promised her a special gift." Sophie perked up. "Daddy, please." Alexander sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Fine. 10 minutes. In the living room." Clara entered calm as ever, carrying a tote bag. Sophie lit up at the sight of her. "Miss Clara." The girl giggled, hugging her tightly. Clara handed Sophie a children's book about the human heart and a plush bear dressed as a doctor. "This is Dr. Hartwell," Clara explained. "He's very good at listening to worries." Sophie clutched the bear. "Can he help Daddy's heart too?" Alexander shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Davis, I appreciate the sentiment, but my daughter has plenty of toys." Clara didn't flinch. "This isn't just a toy. It's a way for her to process what happened. Children need tools, Mr. Grant, especially when adults try to pretend everything is fine." He scoffed. "And what do you know about parenting?" Clara met his gaze squarely. "Enough to know that children don't always tell us what they're feeling. They show us." He sneered. "And what do you know about hearts, anyway? You're just a catering staff now." Her voice remained steady. "I was a cardiac nurse for 8 years before I became a community health worker." Alexander froze, the facade cracking further. Clara continued. "And yes, I lost my job, when I exposed negligence at Memorial Hospital. Some truths are worth losing for. Their eyes locked a collision of two stubborn souls, both wounded, both hiding behind control. His phone rang, breaking the tension. He reached for it automatically, retreating into the comfort of his empire. "I have a meeting." "Of course," Clara replied, gathering her things. "I'll say goodbye to Sophie." But as she walked away, Alexander surprised even himself. "Ms. Davis." His voice softened. "Thank you for what you did at the gala." She paused, offering a small smile. "Just doing my job, Mr. Grant." He swallowed. "Alexander." She repeated his name softly, as if testing the taste of it. Then she left, leaving the name lingering in the stillness of the penthouse. What neither of them knew yet was that the walls between them had shifted and the hardest battles still lay ahead. The Department of Child Welfare building was nothing like the spaces Alexander Grant usually frequented. There were no marble floors here, no glass towers or security guards greeting him by name. The waiting room chairs were worn, the smell of cheap coffee clinging to the air, and the ticking of an old clock amplified his growing impatience. But for once in his life, Alexander couldn't intimidate anyone into giving him what he wanted. Across from him, the social worker, Miss Graves, reviewed a thick file with a clinical detachment that grated against every fiber of his being. "Mr. Grant, we've received reports expressing concern about your recent health crisis and its implications for your ability to provide a stable environment for Sophie." She stated, her tone devoid of sympathy. Alexander leaned forward, his jaw tight. "I'm fine. That incident was a one-off. I am fully capable of caring for my daughter." She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "According to your medical records you submitted during your initial custody hearings, this wasn't a minor event. 3 doctors advised you to take medical leave. You've refused. Multiple times." "I run a global enterprise," Alexander snapped. "I can't just—" "You convinced the court to grant you full custody after your wife's passing because you demonstrated you could balance your obligations and still prioritize Sophie. Recent events suggest otherwise." His lawyer beside him launched into legal arguments, citing Alexander's rights, his resources, his spotless record as a provider. But Alexander barely heard them. For the first time in years, fear gripped him, not for his companies, not for his reputation, but for the possibility of losing the only person who truly mattered. The possibility of the state deciding he was unfit. The thought clawed at his insides, suffocating, more terrifying than any financial crisis he'd ever faced. That night, the walls of his penthouse closed in tighter than ever. He stormed through his office, barking orders into his phone, throwing every connection, every favor, every shred of influence at the problem. But no amount of power could erase the fact that Sophie had witnessed his collapse, that she was scared, that she'd been calling for Clara more than for him. When the doorbell rang, he was startled to find Clara there, sitting with Sophie in the living room, assembling a model of the human heart. "What is she doing here?" His voice was sharp, defensive. The housekeeper appeared flustered. Sir, Miss Sophie was very upset. She begged for Miss Davis. "I thought—" Alexander cut her off. "I don't need you making parenting decisions in my house." Sophie ran to him, clutching the plastic heart model. "Daddy, look. Miss Clara is teaching me about hearts. Did you know yours has a muscle that can get tired if you don't let it rest?" Alexander rubbed his temples. Exhaustion eating away at his temper. He dismissed the housekeeper, sending Sophie to the kitchen. Once they were alone, his carefully constructed facade crumbled. His voice cracked. not with command, but with something raw and unfamiliar. They're threatening to take her away from me, Clara. Clara's demeanor shifted immediately. Concern flickered across her face. Alexander, I'm so sorry, but he wouldn't let himself sit in the vulnerability. His fear morphed, as always, into anger. Is that why you keep showing up? Are you part of this? Did they send you to spy on me? Evaluate me? What Clara looked stunned. No, of course not. You think you know what's best for my daughter? You with your lectures on hearts and parenting. You don't know anything about our life. I know enough to see a little girl who's scared she might lose the only parent she has left. Clara replied calmly but firmly. I know grief. I know trauma. And I know what happens when people like you refuse to face it. Alexander's voice rose. Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed to keep her safe after Sarah died? I've been everything for her. Father, mother, protector. I don't need you or anyone to tell me how to raise my daughter. Clara's eyes softened, but her words remained unflinching. This isn't about your parenting, Alexander. It's about your health. About Sophie's fear of losing you the way she lost her mother. He looked away, the truth finally, pushing past his denial. But still, his pride refused to let go. You're just a stranger, he said bitterly, passing through our lives. Clara stepped back as if struck. Her voice, when she spoke, was quieter, but no less resolute. Maybe. But sometimes, strangers see what family can't. She gathered her bag, pausing at the door. When you're ready to hear the truth instead of your fear speaking for you, call me. Not for me. For Sophie. When she left, the penthouse felt colder than ever. That night, as rain lashed against the windows, Alexander sat in his office, surrounded by his Empire stock reports, contracts, deals waiting for his signature. None of them mattered. Not when his daughter was slipping through his fingers. He ignored the buzzing of his phone, pushed away his untouched whiskey. Instead, he opened his laptop and searched for Clara Davis. The articles told him everything. About the negligence case she exposed, the smear campaign that followed, how she was vindicated too late, how she refused hush money, asking only that hospitals improve their safety protocols. And for the first time, he saw her not as an employee, not as a nuisance, but as a person of extraordinary integrity who had been crushed by the very kind of system he himself had built. A soft knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts. His housekeeper appeared. Sir, Sophie had another nightmare. She's asking for Ms. Clara. Alexander rubbed his face, the weight of his choices suffocating him. I'll go to her. He found Sophie curled up in bed, clutching her teddy bear, tears streaming down her face. I dreamed you fell down again, Daddy, she whispered. But this time you didn't wake up. Alexander's heart shattered into pieces too small to pick up. I'm right here, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere, he promised, though. For the first time, he knew words weren't enough. Sophie sniffled. Miss Clara says hearts need rest, too. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the truth he'd fought so hard to deny. Maybe it was time he listened. Maybe it was time he asked for help, not as a CEO, but as a father. And maybe as a man who couldn't do it alone anymore. 3 weeks later, the rhythms of Alexander Grant's life had changed in ways that would have once seemed impossible to him. The CEO, who once lived by back-to-back meetings, relentless deadlines, and a perpetual chase for more, was now learning the foreign language of stillness. It began with small steps, canceling board meetings, handing over daily operations to his COO, deleting email apps from his phone. but they led to bigger commitments. He formally announced his 3-month medical leave to his board of directors, and for the first time in his career, he didn't feel like the sky was falling. Clara Davis had kept her distance, honoring his space after their last confrontation. Yet even in absence, she lingered in Sophie's heart. The girl asked for her at bedtime, colored pictures for her, and often whispered to her father, "Miss Clara says strong people ask for help." One rainy Tuesday evening, Alexander surprised both of them by showing up at Clara's community clinic, holding a folder containing his signed commitments, medical leave, confirmation therapy appointments, and enrollment in a cardiac rehabilitation program. Clara looked at the documents, her expression unreadable. "Why are you showing me this?" Alexander took a breath deeper than pride usually allowed. "Because you were right, Clara. I don't want to lose my daughter. I don't want to lose myself either." Clara nodded slowly. "Words are easy, Alexander. Change is hard." He met her gaze without flinching. "That's why I'm not asking you to believe me yet. Just watch me." From that night, the transformation accelerated not as a public performance, but as quiet, deliberate acts that reshaped his world from the inside out. He attended a support group for single fathers, sitting in a circle of men he once would have dismissed as weak, for admitting they were overwhelmed, scared, or lonely. There Alexander found himself sharing stories of Sophie's night terrors, of his failures, of his fears of being a ghost in his own daughter's life. He began taking Sophie to school personally, standing awkwardly among other parents, at drop-off uncertain but determined to be present. He let her teach him how to bake terribly, laughing when they ended up covered in flour more than cookies. Clara became a regular presence again, not as his critic, not as his fixer, but as an anchor. She helped Sophie navigate her emotions, read to her on weekends, and slowly her relationship with Alexander softened into something tender, fragile, and yet deeply honest. They never rushed it. They didn't have to. The bond built itself in the spaces between crisis and healing, in the quiet moments of trust, earned rather than given. But progress, as Clara had warned, was not linear. At Sophie's school talent show, Alexander stood backstage, buttoning Sophie's dress, tying her shoelaces with hands that still trembled at the thought of failing her. "What if I mess up, Daddy?" She whispered, her eyes wide with nerves. "Then you keep going, sweetheart," he told her gently. "That's what matters. Not being perfect, just being brave enough to try." But as the lights dimmed and the show began, Alexander's chest tightened, not with pride, but with a sharp, familiar pain. He staggered, trying to mask it, refusing to cause a scene. Clara, waiting in the audience, checked her phone when she received a text from him backstage. "Need help. Don't tell Sophie." Her heart jumped into her throat. She hurried behind the curtains to find him pale, drenched in sweat, gripping the stage railing. "Evan." She began, then caught herself. "Alexander." "How long has it been hurting?" Since the meeting earlier, he admitted, breath shallow. "I thought it was stress." "It might be more," Clara said firmly, already assessing him. "You know what this could be. I'm calling an ambulance." He grabbed her wrist, his voice weak but urgent. Not now. Not during her moment. She hesitated, torn between nurse and protector, between duty and heart. "Okay," she whispered, "but you listen to me now, or Sophie might never get another moment with you." "Understood." He nodded, tears threatening to spill as she helped him sit, stabilizing his breathing while the school principal shielded them from the children's curious eyes. On stage, Sophie played beautifully, unaware of the quiet battle behind the curtain. Clara recorded the entire performance, her hands shaking, whispering silent prayers. When the applause thundered and the curtain fell, Clara knelt beside Sophie, carefully breaking the news that her father had been taken to the hospital. "He promised he'd watch me," Sophie sobbed. "He did," Clara reassured her, showing her the recording. "And he'll see it again. But right now, he needs us to be brave for him." At the hospital, the doctors confirmed it had been a minor heart attack, likely the culmination of years of stress, exhaustion, and neglect catching up, despite his recent improvements. When Alexander finally opened his eyes, he found Sophie curled beside him in the hospital bed, her tiny fingers wrapped tightly around his. Clara stood at the window watching silently. "You recorded it?" Alexander rasped. Clara nodded. Every perfect note. Tears filled his eyes. "I almost missed it. After everything." "But you didn't," Clara said softly. "You were there, Alexander. You've been there for months now. One setback doesn't erase progress." He reached for her hand, the simple gesture carrying more vulnerability than any speech he'd ever given. "I almost lost everything tonight." She didn't pull away. "But you didn't." "I'm not afraid anymore," he whispered. "Not of slowing down. Not of asking for help. Not of—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Not of loving again." Her breath caught their hands, entwined in the quiet hospital room, the world outside fading into insignificance. "One day at a time," Alexander, Clara said gently, her voice filled with something like hope. "One day at a time," he echoed, holding her gaze, as if anchoring himself to something solid, something real. Because for the first time in his life, he understood this wasn't about conquering the world. It was about finally learning how to live in it. 1 year after the night that changed everything, Alexander Grant stood barefoot on the wraparound porch of a modest beach house, watching the morning sun cast golden ribbons across the waves. The once untouchable CEO of Grant Luxury Enterprises now preferred the hum of the sea over the chaos of corporate boardrooms. His days of chasing profit margins and flawless projections had given way to something far simpler and infinitely more precious. In his hands, he held a stack of drafts for a children's book, Dr. Hartwell's Big Adventure, written by Sophie, with some editing help from Clara. It told the story of a brave little heart doctor bear who taught children and grown-ups how to listen to their hearts, to recognize when they were tired and when they needed extra love. Clara stepped onto the porch, 2 mugs of tea in her hands. She was wearing a soft cotton dress, her hair loose in the salty breeze, and on her finger a simple engagement ring glowed faintly in the morning light. She handed him one of the mugs before settling beside him, their silence rich with comfort. "Final edits?" she asked, nodding at the pages in his lap. "Almost done." Alexander replied, his voice softer now, unhurried. "The foundation wants to distribute them to all the new cardiac centers next month. The Grant Heart Foundation, once a side project buried under layers of PR, had become his primary focus, now co-directed with Clara. Together, they'd shifted its mission entirely, dedicating its resources to providing cardiac care in underserved communities, focusing not only on treatment, but on prevention and education. Alexander no longer held the title of CEO. He had stepped down, taking the quieter role of chairman of the board, working part-time mentoring young executives while devoting his best energy to his family and his foundation. And to his health, down on the shore, Sophie played with a small, scruffy puppy they had adopted from a local shelter. She was more radiant than ever, laughter dancing on the wind, her fears from that terrible year, now distant shadows, replaced by the solid foundation of love, stability, and presence. She seems happy, Clara observed, smiling as Sophie chased the puppy across the sand. We all are, Alexander replied, taking Clara's hand in his. I never thought I'd say this, but collapsing on that stage was the best thing that ever happened to me. Clara raised an eyebrow. Teasing? Better than our engagement. He chuckled his laugh, easier now, free of the old hardness. Maybe a close second. They fell into a quiet rhythm, watching Sophie draw heart shapes in the wet sand. The girl still talked about her mother sometimes, but there was no longer fear in her eyes when she did. Instead, there was acceptance and a joy in knowing her father wasn't going anywhere, not anymore. Any regrets? Clara asked, her voice gentle but curious. About stepping away from the business world, Alexander considered it, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I spent years building hotel empires where strangers could feel at home, but I never made time to create an actual home for myself and Sophie. That's my only regret, how long it took me to see what was right in front of me. Clara squeezed his hand, leaning into him, the easy closeness between them no longer new but deeply rooted. Sophie came running up the beach steps, breathless and glowing. Mom, Dad, can we have dinner on the beach tonight, please? They exchanged a glance, still cherishing every time Sophie called Clara Mom, a name that had arrived gently, naturally, without prompting, like it had been waiting for its moment to surface. I think that sounds perfect, Clara smiled. Sophie giggled and ran back toward the puppy, leaving them alone with the sound of waves and seagulls. Alexander kissed Clara's temple, brushing a stray hair from her face. You know, he murmured, for a cardiac nurse, you're pretty good at fixing broken hearts. Clara smiled knowingly, especially stubborn CEOs. They both laughed, a sound that blended with the wind as they watched Sophie twirl in the golden glow of the setting sun. Together, they had built something from the wreckage of their pasts. A family that wasn't defined by titles, by blood, or by appearances, but by love, patience, and the courage to admit they needed one another. In the end, the greatest lesson Alexander had learned wasn't written in any contract or business plan. It was that strength wasn't about never falling. It was about letting yourself be caught, about allowing others in, about showing up every day, even when it was messy, imperfect, and vulnerable. Sometimes the bravest thing wasn't leading an empire. It was choosing to stand still, to be present, to love. And as the sun dipped below the ocean, casting the world in hues of amber and rose, Alexander, Clara, and Sophie stood together, three figures, against the vastness of the sea, a family stitched together from broken pieces, stronger at the cracks, more beautiful for their imperfections. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better. It was real. Alexander Grant's story is one of profound transformation, a journey from invincible titan to vulnerable father, from corporate conqueror to a man who finally learned to live, to love, and to let go. At the height of his power, Alexander believed he had it all. Wealth influenced the respect of an entire industry. But beneath the immaculate suits and boardroom victories, he was a man running on empty, desperately clinging to control. In the aftermath of personal loss, he never dared to process. It took the collapse of his own body on a stage, meant to celebrate his generosity, to finally expose the cracks he'd spent years covering up. And when his world crumbled, the only person brave enough to step into the chaos was Clara Davis, a woman he had once cast aside, yet who, in his darkest hour, held not only his life, but his daughter's fragile heart in her hands. Clara was no stranger to standing alone in the face of power. Her own past bore scars from choosing integrity over comfort, from risking everything to do what was right. But what made her strength remarkable wasn't just her clinical skill. It was her empathy, her ability to see beyond the man Alexander projected to the terrified, grieving father beneath. Their journey together wasn't easy. It was raw, messy, and filled with setbacks. Alexander fought every step of the way, clinging to old patterns until they no longer served him. But slowly, through Clara's unwavering honesty and Sophie's innocent need, he learned that leadership wasn't about never falling. It was about having the courage to rise again, differently, more humbly, more fully present. In the end, Alexander didn't just change his life, he rewrote his legacy. He stepped away from the empire he built, choosing instead to pour his energy into healing both his own heart and the hearts of others through the Grant Heart Foundation. Together with Clara and Sophie, he built a new kind of empire, one not measured in profits or accolades, but in love, trust, and the quiet power of presence. The lesson we can take from Alexander and Clara's story is timeless. Sometimes life will bring us to our knees, not to break us, but to force us to see what truly matters. Success titles and external achievements mean little if we lose ourselves and those we love along the way. True strength is found not in standing alone, but in daring to lean on others, to ask for help, to admit when we're scared, lost, or wrong. In our fast-paced, achievement-obsessed world, how often do we ignore the warning signs of burnout, loneliness, or fractured relationships? How many of us, like Alexander, hide behind busyness, afraid to sit with our own hearts? Perhaps it's time to ask ourselves what would change if we allowed vulnerability to be a bridge instead of a weakness. What about you? Have you ever experienced a moment that forced you to slow down, reevaluate, and rediscover what truly matters? We would love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences in the comments below, and let's create a space where we can learn from one another's journeys. And if this story moved, you don't forget to support our channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing. Your support fuels more inspiring content like this. See you in the next heart-touching story.